Hey everyone, you are listening to the 5th episode in the ClassofHC 2016 Election Clapback podcast. It's a series that was inspired by a good book that I read this summer, and a series that's also been provoked by the foolishness that we have all seen in this year's presidential election campaign in the U.S. I am Deji, the host of the Class of Hope and Change podcast documentary. You can find out more about that project at ClassofHC.com. Last time in episode 4, we looked at a period when America was great for a majority, but not all of the population, the 1920s. Today, we're going to talk about a time when America wasn't so great, the 1930s. For those of you who are listening to this series for the first time, thanks for checking us out. Like I said, this series was inspired by a really good book that I read this summer. It was called Economix, Economix, by Michael Goodwin and Dan Burr. Although I don't know the authors and I'm certainly not getting paid to plug their book, definitely was an inspiration for this project and led me to ask a lot of questions, which I thought some other people might have, and so here we are. And I also believe in giving credit where it's due. So the link is in the bio. Definitely check out the link and the book if you are interested in more information about what they've done. They basically took a comic book approach to American history, and I think it's pretty clever, so some of you may be interested in checking that out. So last time we left off talking about the 1920s when increased wages for manufacturing jobs, better working conditions for Americans because of the struggles of labor unions, the invention of consumer credit, which allowed people to purchase things they did not fully have cash for, technology and home appliances, and cars made life much more accessible and comfortable for many Americans in the 1920s than it had been for their parents and grandparents just a few decades earlier. At the same time, while things were being opened up for many Americans, we also had race riots, lynching of Black Americans that limited their opportunities and thus limited the opportunities of the number of Americans who could fully enjoy this improved life. So we start the story for this episode where the book talks about the 1929 stock market crash, where during the years prior in the early 1920s, you had people buying lots of stocks. Stocks seemed like they were always going up. People started borrowing money to buy more stocks because it seemed like such a good bet to make money on stocks. So everything seemed like it was going up and it was never going to come down. And then it stopped going up. And so banks started to see that and they got worried and they started asking for their money back for all the people they gave loans to. And since the people who took the money put them in stocks because they thought the stocks were going to go up, when the stocks went down, they didn't have any money, which means banks didn't get paid, which means banks didn't have any money, which means investors got nervous. Things got bad very quickly. So the period from 1929 to 1941, which was when World War II started, generally we can call the Great Depression. There were periods and times when things got a little bit better and times when things were much worse. But in general, you can think of that time as the Great Depression. So in 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was the cousin of Teddy Roosevelt, who we talked about in an earlier episode, gets elected president of the U.S., and he gets elected by promising Americans a series of programs that he calls the New Deal. And I think it's important to talk about kind of all the things that happened during that period of time, regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum. We are in a similar moment where things look dark for a lot of people, and we are told often that government just can't do anything, and there's gridlock and so forth and so on. But in this Election Clapback series, I think part of what we're trying to do is talk about what is possible and to remove this talk of what can't be done if humans, particularly in our society, decide that we wish to do something for our betterment, then we can and should do it. So, give you an example of what was happening in 1932 with FDR. His administration set up agencies, government agencies, that employed Americans, literally, paid people to build all sorts of things. They built the Hoover Dam, which is in the southwest part of the country. They built the Golden Gate Bridge, was partially funded, Lincoln Tunnel in Manhattan and New York City. They had programs for theater, programs for artists, programs for writers, where they were using federal money to support the activity of many Americans, literally building infrastructure, but also building schools, painting, fixing infrastructure, and things of that nature. During FDR, they started unemployment insurance. So any of you who've ever got unemployment insurance after you got laid off from a job, that got created during this time when America wasn't so great, during the Great Depression. FDR's administration, the Congress, the government at that time, also set up the Social Security Administration. So this is where they took a little bit of money in terms of taxes from all the working Americans and used it to help give money to senior citizens who had retired and were too old to work, or for people who were disabled and unable to work, and for widows and children. Because remember, at that time in the 30s, many women did not work outside of the home. And so for a person to be a widow was potentially financially devastating. And so the Social Security Administration was set up to also help widows and children of workers who had died. Continuing, just again, to give you a sense of the kind of things that were happening when America wasn't so great. And so all these programs are being created by the government. FDR's administration also created agencies that helped farmers balance out the crop prices so that they wouldn't lose too much money or be put out of business in years when their crop prices were not high enough, or in years when their harvests weren't so good. He helped them kind of even out how much money they made so they had enough to keep going every year. FDR's administration also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which helped protect people's savings in case the banks go out of business. Because remember, what just happened is a whole bunch of banks got put out of business because they lent a whole bunch of people money who put it in the stock market, and the stock market went down. So people were scared to put their money in banks, which, remember, as we talked about in episode 1, part of the whole system that we've constructed is dependent on banking and dependent on people getting loans and things like that. So very important that people have faith in banks, or else capitalism has trouble working. So he created that to help ensure people's savings, that if they put money in, the bank went out, they would still get some of their money back, or all of their money back, depending on how big it was. So they also passed laws that separate what banks did. So the banks that wanted to do investments, buying and selling stocks, issuing bonds, helping corporations find funding for things, they separated that from banks that just took people's savings, working people's savings, and made loans for cars and homes and things like that. So they broke those two apart so that banks wouldn't be selling people bad investments. They also passed the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, to regulate the stock market so that there were some rules and guidelines around what businesses had to do if they wanted to participate in the stock market. So the book goes into much more detail about the ideas and the theories and the debates at the time and some of the consequences of FDR's decisions. And there are literally hundreds of books on FDR, the New Deal, and the Depression, so you can read that if you're interested. But for me, the election clapback question that we have to come back to is, when should the government step in to give people money or jobs? When should the government step in to help large corporations and big industries? Will economies get better on their own? Some people don't like when the government steps in. You hear a lot of that now. So some people believe the government shouldn't do anything. Leave it alone. The economy will figure it out. Is that what you think? What does it mean for our economy to get better? We're about to enter debate season at the time that this is being recorded, and people talk about the economy getting worse and get better. And the question is going to be, what does it mean for the economy to get better? What does that actually look like? Is it sufficient that you have a job? Is it sufficient that you have a job that can pay for you to have a place to live and to have food to eat and for your children to be okay? Is it that the job pays enough to have savings? Is it enough that you have money to start your own business? What does it look like for the economy to get better? That's a specific question we need to make sure that we're all asking. So we see from the Depression that it's possible for our elected representatives in government to pass and create policies that help make life better for American citizens. We also see that once government starts a program and starts spending money on something, it's hard for them to stop, which is why we still have all those programs that I named off, and we're so familiar with them even 100 years later. One of the things that is also important for me in this Election Clapback series is the work of honest truth-telling. So much of what we talk about in this moment, as I've spoke about in other episodes, presumes a lack of knowledge of what was actually going on, the full context of what was going on in America during these times that we talk about. One of the things that's important to continue to discuss, particularly for those people who think that some of the recent conversations that we've been having in this country are new, who find themselves confused by why people can't get over certain things, who are under the impression that everything is okay. It's important to talk about just how deep some of this baggage, some of these elements are in our culture when it comes to how Americans relate to each other. And so one of the things that struck out to me as I was reading through the book and thinking about all the different concepts was that even while people were suffering in depression, while a lot of people felt betrayed, abused, taken advantage of, the tribalism, the mythology, the hostility towards Black Americans in particular in this country did not end. Poverty, joblessness, homelessness among 25, 33, 40% of the population in the U.S. was not enough to deal with, to expose the myths of racial superiority that were held by Americans at the time. One of the things that many voters in our country are not aware of, again, is the extent of how public policy and attitudes towards certain Americans undermines the promise of our country at times. And so I think it's important in this election clapback moment to reckon with the work that has been done, things that were done while we thought good things were happening. It's important to get the full story. And so to that point, I want to talk about the New Deal and how it affected some Black people in the South, particularly, to give you a sense of the fact that even when we're told in our history books that this good thing happened, still there was always that undercurrent of, not treating everyone equal. That even when the government was doing something good, there was still an element that brought in some other type of energy that wasn't about justice and equality. So one of the conflicts around the time was whether or not, when the government started paying people to do all these things, as I spoke about earlier, they were going to pay everybody the same, right? Universal equality for Americans. Unfortunately, that didn't play well in certain parts of the country, and I will read an excerpt from an editorial in the Thomasville, Georgia Times-Enterprise, that's the name of the newspaper, from July 31st, 1933. Feel free to look it up. This expressed some of the sentiments of, in particular, Southern businessmen who were thinking about these programs and how it would impact their community. And I quote now from the editorial from July 1933, Thomasville Times-Enterprise. Quote, "The various groups in Thomasville have all met, elected their chairman, and gone to work studying to see how far they can go in meeting the full requirements. It is safe to say that no store in town with delivery or porter service will sign an agreement to pay that boy $14 per week. If he does, the messenger will be some white boy who will do the work satisfactorily. In that event, we will have all white jobs and the Negroes out of work except in domestic circles. Many of them are unskilled and cannot earn enough to produce the wage even at greatly exalted prices. A delivery boy in a drugstore would make 50 trips per week. That is at the rate of 25 cents per trip, while a Western Union boy will do it for a dime. When the Negroes get the idea that they are going to be paid $14 per week, they are being poorly led, misinformed. They cannot hope to get that, and any organization to attempt to put that over will meet with a form of resistance that will prove very, very unfortunate to many of them. Business must be operated ably to win. The government cannot afford to penalize any business in a way that will bring on bankruptcy, and that is just what many fear, for they cannot come up to that scale where they hire 100 or more Negroes and keep going for even a month unless they have great financial reserves. The modifications in that regard are being studied. The labor differential in the South is all that keeps us in competition." End quote. So one of the issues at the time was the problem that Southern business owners felt that if they paid everybody the same, which is what the government said. So government says, hey, we're going to fund money for you to build this thing, pay everybody who works on it, whatever, $10 a week. So in the South, what that meant was that if Black folks were going to make the same as white folks, then the argument was that there'd be enough white people in the community who would vote against that, right? And so that's something we have to reckon with in our country. What does that mean? That if there's money being provided in a time of suffering, that there would be folks who would vote against that. That is not something we haven't fully dealt with in our time. This is an editorial that was written to the Macon Telegraph, Macon, Georgia Telegraph newspaper under the date of August 5th, 1933. So this is a citizen of that community speaking to the editor of that newspaper about the idea that both Black and white workers in the South in this particular community would be paid the same. Quote, "Your speeches and editorials on the greater things promised the South in the New Deal are fine, and every word is gospel. But when you talk about being fair and generous toward the Negro, you are on an unpopular side, and you had better watch out. It is grand and glorious that so many of the poorly paid white people have been given benefits under the New Deal, such as increased wages, shorter hours, and better living conditions. That will have an effect upon the entire section. But this other race that is ever with us must be carried along to better things also. They will help us or they will hinder us. It depends on our decision." End quote. So to illustrate kind of some of the other tensions that were going on, I wanted to share a few excerpts from a PBS series, an excellent one that was done on some of the conflicts even within the NAACP, which was an organization founded to work on issues around racial justice in America, and kind of how the tensions of the Depression were even affecting work that was happening within organizations focused on the lives of people of color, and particularly Black Americans. These are some excerpts from the PBS documentary.
Better for African Americans in the early 1930s was a formidable task. As Langston Hughes said, the Depression had knocked everyone down a peg or two, and Negroes had but a few pegs to fall. The NAACP, like the rest of America, was struggling to survive.
For the great majority of Americans, the single overriding fact is the Great Depression and the need to combat that depression, the need to get the American economy rolling again. Everything else was secondary.
In 1933, a new president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was elected. He had promised a New Deal for everyone. But to get the economy rolling, he would need the support of Southern senators. Programs to advance racial equality would have to wait.
That was a short excerpt from a PBS series titled Walter White versus W.E.B. Du Bois. Feel free to look that up and check that out. Very, very interesting material about some of what was going on in the times. Again, very important to expand the conversation and make sure that we understand that throughout American history, that we've always had this tension between treating everyone equally, between doing what's right for all American citizens, and between the profound hatred, particularly directed towards Black Americans, that undermines much of the promise of this country. So very important to keep in mind, what will we do with that going forward in this election clapback season? Next time, we'll talk about when America was great again. Thanks for listening. Have a great one.